Everyone knows about wasps. He's pretty aggressive, also very rampant. We humans won't provoke him. And look, this is a beehive. But what about in nature? He has enemies. His natural enemy is actually donating the head plump. And they eat wasps. It's like eating melon seeds, the end of a nest. The old irons will be able to see it in a while. Pointed bee eagle their fur. The wasp's poison needle didn't work on him. The eyes are all protected. Take a look at eating wasps. The end of a nest. What's the concept? Ruthless or not, pointed bee eagle. It is also an animal protected by our country. Not a lot. Hey, hello. Chloe, not your issue. An eagle, definitely a big bird of prey. Overlord in the sky. Look at this mouth. That's pretty sharp. Claws are also his main weapon of attack. This little leopard go out alone. This mother leopard is also careless. Watch the eagles swoop down. Easily capture the cheetah cubs. Eagle eye is the speed of a leopard. That look is absolutely superb. It's easy to catch the little leopard. Brought back to the nest. There's nothing a mother leopard can do. Today's eagle hunt was a success. I'll end the video here. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the Naoyan TV channel to receive more videos in the future. African hound versus African wild dog. Check out this African hound. Come and grab the food of African wild dogs. They are natural enemies. Meeting is doing. No mercy. This antelope is pretty fierce. The hound is called the second brother. There's number one on the African savanna. Except for the lion, he is the second. What about the African wild dog, known as the third brother? Both of them are steel shops on the African grassland. The head of the department is good at Udao gang. Competing for prey. Hounds and dingoes. Ready to fight. The war between them, which side has the largest number? Side victory. Today, the African wild dogs have the upper hand. Although they themselves are the director party of Gang Chonky, I am also afraid that the other party will attack his butt. What about African wild dogs? They breed quite fast, growth every year. Very impressive. Look at this. In the future, the position of this second brother of the hound will be banned. If you go it alone, the hound must have the upper hand. There he is. I've been protecting my butt. Afraid of being ripped out. And his companion still hasn't arrived. Oh, a few came. This hound grabs the food and runs away. A piece of meat in his mouth. Look at this on the African savanna. It's not easy to eat, is it? Risk your life. Hit the road. The African wild dog is winning this war. Silverback gorilla. It usually refers to the King Kong orangutan. This head is bigger. Height can reach 1.78 meters. Weight can reach about 200 kilograms. This size, is it also a hegemon in the animal kingdom? This is the King Kong orangutan in the zoo. Okay, ha ha ha, have a nice day. They are also a group life. It's quite a cry. So loud, how many kilometers away? This Yinbei gorilla. He's always a vegetarian. Mainly bamboo shoots and fruits. Basically no natural enemies. His bite force can also reach 600 kilograms. The lion is only 300 kilograms. Running speed can reach 35 kilometers per hour. So say this. A lion is not necessarily a match for a gorilla. Let's take a look. The war between leopards and scraps. This little leopard. Waste not only eat fruits and vegetable leaves. He also eats small animals, including small leopards and small lions. This little leopard was scrapped and taken down. He will eat some bird eggs. So this is useless. Ah, it's pretty hateful too. This mother flower newspaper is also confused. I can't find the tip. It's not that I can't find the little flower newspaper. Leopards are also very good at climbing trees. That Phi-Phi, holding a baby leopard ready to go up the tree. Is this leopard up a tree? Prepare to rescue the leopard cubs. There's a bunch of waste down there. He is also doomed today. Adult Daifofei is very aggressive. It's over. The little leopard fell and died. She was crying.